You're live.
Hey, good morning. It is April 29th in Senate Judiciary. We're taking back up the 578 when we have Ledge Counsel here to walk us through some of the changes we proposed the last time around. And the floor is all yours.
Great. For the record, Hillary Chiller Ames, the Office of Legislative Counsel. We have a draft number 2.2, and there are, I think there are 3 edits requested from the committee last time that the committee discussed this bill. So the first is on page 15. This is a section about when a humane officer may seize an animal, and specifically when an owner voluntarily surrenders an animal. So this is subdivision 1, page 15 on line 5. And the discussion that the committee has been having on this and related provisions is where there is a requirement, in this case, to have a surrendered animal examined within 72 hours, what the appropriate remedy is for a failure to do that, if any. So the committee have decided with respect to the consultation with the Secretary of Agriculture and the bringing a vet with you to seize, that it was appropriate to affirm what courts have already said, which is that failure to do that shall not be grounds for dismissal of the enforcement action or for exclusion of evidence. But there was some more discussion about whether voluntary surrender required something different. And I think last time what the committee discussed was that if voluntary surrender didn't have any language about failure, meaning not grounds for dismissal of the action or exclusion of evidence, a court would imply that that kind of silence in comparison to including any other provisions meant that dismissal could be an option or exclusion of evidence could be an option. But the committee was concerned about if there was some delay and some deterioration in the condition of the animal between the surrender and the assessment by the vet, that the owner still be able to present any evidence of the animal's condition at the time of the surrender. So the way this language is crafted, the first new sentence, starting on line 9, is this: failure to have the animal examined and assessed within 72 hours or as soon as reasonably practicable shall not be grounds for dismissal of an enforcement action or exclusion of evidence. That ensures that consistent treatment across these sections. The second sentence, and I will say, I think that language is enough, saying that the state's evidence can't be excluded for failure to have the animal assessed by a vet within 72 hours or as soon as reasonably practicable. That's really what that first sentence is saying. It's not saying anything about the evidence the owner can put in. But the second sentence is an option if the committee wants to be really clear about that concern, and that would specify that this shall not prevent the owner from introducing otherwise admissible evidence, including otherwise admissible evidence of the animal's condition at the time of the voluntary surrender. So my legal advice would be that this second sentence is not strictly necessary, that the way the first one is crafted would not cover the owner's ability to introduce evidence, but it is always an option for the legislature to be crystal clear about its intent. And so if adding that second sentence brings comfort, that is certainly an option to be very clear. Any questions about that edit before we move forward to the next?
Well, I'm always supportive of getting rid of language that is unnecessary or redundant. And so I just want to make sure I fully understand one more time, by me, how, if we were to remove this, how the defendant would still be able to introduce evidence that's otherwise admissible about the animal's condition at the time of the surrender, just because it's silent on it.
So the way this first sentence is crafted, it doesn't say whose failure to have the animal examined and assessed, right? But whose failure will be the state. So if the state fails to have the animal examined or assessed, that's not grounds to exclude the state's evidence. I totally appreciate that it does not say the state's evidence, but the way it is crafted, that is how it would be interpreted.
So I guess I don't know if I'm getting too into the weeds with the hypotheticals, but I guess my concern is if there is evidence that comes, after the animal's been surrendered, and it is the state of the animal after having been in the kennel or wherever it's being held, and that evidence comes from it after it's been surrendered.
Yep.
That's my concern. Does that make sense?
Yes. So the way this would kind of play out would be, say the state doesn't have the animal assessed within 72 hours or some reasonably practical time. Defendant is the one who's going to try to exclude that evidence. They're going to say, look, well, if we don't have this sentence, they're going to say, look at the statute. It requires that you have the animal examined by a vet. You didn't do it within 72 hours or as soon as was reasonably practicable. And because you have not complied with this statutory requirement, that is grounds for exclusion of your evidence, really your vet and vet condition evidence. Adding this first sentence prevents the defendant from making that argument. It very explicitly says that's not a reason to exclude evidence. Your scenario is the owner says, I want to introduce evidence that when I surrendered the animal, its condition was fine. There's nothing about the vet requirement that speaks to the owner's obligation or the owner's evidence. So if the state is saying, like, I want to exclude motion from an A or a trial, whatever it is, or hearing, if they want to say we want to exclude the owner's evidence at the time of trial, they have to give a basis for it. And it would be a basis that the state, the humane officer, didn't comply with the 72-hour requirement. They'd have to say some other, it's not otherwise relevant or admissible. So hopefully it's a more helpful explanation of why I think the first sentence is enough.
Yeah.
But again, sometimes explicit clarity can be helpful. So I don't think there's anything wrong with adding the second sentence, but I did just want to say that I do think the first would be sufficient.
Any thoughts or questions? I mean, I'm kind of on the fence. I mean, it can't hurt to have the clarity, but yeah.
So I just had a quick question, Howard.
Mhm.
So if we were, as a for instance, to eliminate the second line, would that still change the court procedures? They still can admit admissible evidence, right?
Exactly. This second sentence is just kind of repeating the standard the court would generally use, saying that, the evidence can only come in if the court finds it's relevant and admissible. And so it's just saying, as long as you're otherwise going to admit this evidence, nothing about this section is the basis to exclude that kind of evidence. But because this section speaks to an obligation on the part of the state or the humane officer, it doesn't give rise to an argument for excluding the owner's evidence.
Slightly different question.
Mhm.
So it says on line 7 through line 9, there's a shall. So the humane officer is being directed in no uncertain terms to have the animal examined and assessed within 72 hours, or then we make it very flexible, or as soon as reasonably practical. But it's still a shall. But then in these next two sentences, we basically say if you don't follow that, these consequences won't come about. Are there other consequences that could come about? I see a nod. I'm assuming that there are, in which case I would be fine. For instance, could the person sue at that point because it's clearly not reasonably practical time? 5 months have gone by, they still have my.
So I think your question flags what this language does allow, which if the surrendered animal is examined within 72 hours, they're clearly within, there is some room in what it means to be as soon as reasonably practicable. A defendant could make an argument that at a certain point, the time period was not reasonably practical.
Right. And then they have an action available to them.
I think they have an argument in the context of the case to say, your evidence is from 5 months. I also think this is not a likely occurrence, but this would not prevent them from making an argument to say, you did not comply with the provision as soon as reasonably practicable. And it only says that the failure to have it examined within 72 hours or as soon as reasonably practicable shall not be grounds.
Right.
So if the animal is not examined as soon as reasonably practicable, this leaves open the argument that it should still be grounds for dismissal or exclusion of evidence.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not the best person to speak to whether this has ever come up in a proceeding and whether that kind of time period has ever happened. But the language does allow for that.
Lisa, did you want to provide any input since you're here?
Sure. So Lisa Milet, Director of Animal Welfare for the Department of Public Safety, for Vermont, for the record. One of the big consequences would be most evidence that you're going to collect from the animal's body disappears quickly. So starvation, dehydration, even trauma, all of that, once they're getting appropriate care, just disappears. So you won't have good evidence of cruelty if it's one of those cases and you didn't get to the vet. And frankly, you're going to want to draw blood before you give them food. You're going to want to draw blood before you give them water if it's one of those circumstances. So vets can very accurately date things that happened recently as far as when they happened, and you're just not going to have good evidence if it's one of those things. One reason I really wanted this language saying not bringing the case law in is that there are cases where vet evidence is not relevant to the case. So let's say there's videotaped cruelty that happened a year ago. Right? The animal's body today is not good evidence of that. And if you impose a cost on localities, because somebody has to pay for the vet appointment, and that within 72 hours, there's a good chance you're paying an emergency fee for a vet appointment. Somebody has to pay for that. And if it's not relevant to the case, whatever the vet's going to do, then I think it's problematic to say you have to incur this cost because there are already lots of costs with animal cases which are impeding them getting investigated or prosecuted. But what I see as the major consequence of this, if it's a starvation case and you don't take the animal to the vet within 72 hours, you just won't have evidence to prosecute the case with, and you're going to lose it in many cases, unless the animal's at the point like not being able to stand, but you have to be able to exclude the other reasons for that condition. And so to me, like with I completely agree with Hillary in terms of the first sentence I think is very important and it codifies the case law that's out there. The second sentence is being extremely clear is never an issue. I don't think it harms anything. I also don't see it as being necessary, but at the same time, that's just a call for the commission.
Thank you. That is helpful. I think, yeah, I mean, the more I think about it, even though it is being more clear, there is always, running the risk of, if we're adding this language here,
Right.
why isn't it in the other sections as well? And that can always create confusion. So I'm of the mind to strike that second sentence unless there are objections and other arguments and keep it in. Very good. All right, great. We can strike through that.
You're okay with that one?
All right, moving on to the second of the three edits. This is page 20, line 10. This is talking about the forfeiture hearing. And this was something we discussed last time based on a request from McManus and the Department of State Attorneys and Sheriffs. That under current law, this happens in the criminal division. Forfeiture proceedings happen in the criminal division. There was some discussion about when on the House side that if there was going to be a really strict, quick requirement for holding the hearing, could the civil division do that more quickly or not? But the discussion last time was that there was not no one had reported a clear reason why it should be changed, and I think DSS put forward several points about why it should remain the same, given how state attorneys currently handle this. So this is an internal change that this would be the hearing is held in the criminal division, but that would be consistent with the way this currently handled the existing law.
Any questions or comments? Okay. Thank you.
The final change comes at the end. So starting on page 20 and then reference to page 29. This is adding a new section, section 8. And this was something that we discussed last time, that the bill generally provides that the amount of the security shall be set in rules adopted by the Director of Animal Welfare. When this takes effect on July 1st, 2026, there will not be rules setting the amount of the security. So there is a gap between when this bill goes into effect and when rules are adopted, setting the amount of security. This new section 8 is something that Lisa and I worked on. That would be a gap filler, essentially, setting a security amount until from the effective date until rules are approved. So this would provide that until the Director of Animal Welfare adopts rules, the amount of security shall be required pursuant to this section. So it's in two parts. It speaks to all animals other than livestock, which includes domestic pets and poultry, but anything that is not livestock. Security shall be required in the amount of $1 per animal per day for food. And if the seizing officer determines that immediate veterinary care is required to protect the animal's health or safety, $250 per animal for veterinary services. That's the first bucket for animals, all animals other than livestock. The second bucket is for livestock. Security shall be required in the amount of $2.50 per animal per day for food. And if the seizing officer determines that immediate veterinary care is required to protect the animal's health or safety, $500 per animal for veterinary services. We talked about those provisions.
Where did the dollar amounts come from? Because I'm thinking about the bag of food that I buy for my dog. How $1 per day seems very small. I don't know. I'm just curious where the dollar amounts came from.
They were just rough estimates. I made. Hillary and I discussed that the numbers in the statute should be lower than whatever is going to come out in the schedule. I anticipate breaking it down by the type of animal. And Hillary and I discussed for the statute having to be a lower amount, not overshooting in any way. And so this is just ballpark based on shelter prices that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. I think I spend about $4.50 a day at least to feed my dog. And that's fair. And I also feed my dog fairly premium food.
Yeah, and the point of the security.
Sorry.
Oh, no. The point of the security is not necessarily to cover every single cost they might incur. It's so that there's some amount that you're responsible for caring for your animal. So put in some amount in order to get the hearing and preserve it. And the cost of care determination by the judge on the other end makes up the difference. And so to me, I'd rather have a lower bar to someone actually exercising their right to have the hearing if they don't feel comfortable asking for a waiver for that reason. And so to me, it makes sense to have this be a lower end calculation, also not just because of the whole Hillary and stuff. And the vet fees are also extremely low. If you're getting emergency vet care, you're not paying $250 for a dog or $500 for a horse, right? But it's hard to say what those numbers are.
Right.
And so once again, I'd rather err on the side of low and have it made up on the tail end rather than having it be high and somebody having to come up with an amount of money that is not comfortable for them just to preserve the life.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sarah.
So, and on the other side, talking about this, so if I bring in 3 chickens, it's going to cost $750 for emergency vet fees.
If they need urgent, if they have broken legs, if they have broken wing, if they need urgent vet care, that's determined by the officer. Odds are, but actually, yeah, so they would be under the non-livestock. So it would be $750 if the impounding officer determined they needed vet care to preserve their life or safety, I think.
That's health or safety.
But it's not just for an exam. It's not for the cruelty exam to gather evidence. That's not the vet. It's only if it's preserving their health or safety.
And if $750 for the 3 chickens presented a hardship, then the waiver request provisions of the bill still apply. So even in this interim period, the reduction or waiver of the security procedure remains in place.
And can you remind me when the rules are supposed to be made?
Don't think the bill specifies, but let me confirm that.
Chris, no, my intent would be to do them as quickly as reasonably possible. However, in rulemaking, there's always things I can't control, like whether my proposed schedule gets adopted by the legislature next year.
Yeah.
And so there's necessarily a gap until next legislative session. Hopefully it's not longer than that, but
Yeah, this will be on page 20. Line 17 through 19. The amount of the security and payment schedule shall be set in rules adopted by the Director of Animal Welfare pursuant to 20 VSA and 3202E. So it does not provide a deadline.
Okay. Okay, anything on this final section?
No.
Thank you, Hillary. I do want to have a full committee here, for one of the books. I know Senator Pat is probably getting about 20 minutes or so. In the meantime, is there anything else? Any other issues on this bill we need to address before the vote? All right, so we can, yeah, and is everybody good to vote?
Yes.
Right, okay. All right, so we will take a break until Senator Matos gets here, and then we will vote. Yeah, around the board. Okay. So
Thank
you can take a break now. And thank you, Hillary. And we can, please.